The Hitchhiker. The highway stretched into the abyss, a winding path through the dark, silent forest. Lydia tightened her grip on the steering wheel, the white lines on the road blurring into one continuous streak. She had taken this route a dozen times, but tonight felt different. The night seemed darker, the trees more menacing. She had been driving for hours, fatigue tugging at her eyelids. The radio was her only companion, a faint murmur in the background. Suddenly, the signal cut out, leaving her in eerie silence. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires against the asphalt. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, startling her. She glanced at the screen, a message from her friend. "Drive safe! Don't pick up any hitchhikers!" Lydia chuckled nervously, her eyes flicking back to the road. As if on cue, her headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside. A man, tall and thin, with his thumb outstretched. His clothes were dark, his face obscured by shadows. Lydia's heart raced, her friend's warning echoing in her mind. She pressed her foot down on the accelerator, speeding past the man without a second thought. A few miles later, she spotted him again. Standing by the road, his thumb still out. Panic surged through her veins. It couldn't be the same man. She must be imagining things. She glanced in the rearview mirror, but he was gone. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Lydia's hands shook as she drove, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her car suddenly sputtered and died, coasting to a stop. She cursed under her breath, her pulse quickening. The gas gauge read empty, though she was certain she had filled up before leaving. She fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. A soft tapping on the window made her jump. She turned slowly, her blood running cold. The hitchhiker stood there, his face now visible. It was pale, almost luminous in the darkness, his eyes hollow and devoid of life. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice a guttural whisper. Lydia's scream caught in her throat. She locked the doors, her fingers trembling. The hitchhiker's smile widened, revealing sharp, glistening teeth. He pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging the window. "You can't escape," he whispered. Lydia closed her eyes, praying for dawn. But in the inky blackness of the night, she knew the sun might never rise again. Dark woods. The dark woods. Once upon a time, in a small village nestled at the edge of a vast, foreboding forest, there lived a young woodcutter named Hans. Hans was brave and kind-hearted, known for his skill in felling trees and his generous nature. However, despite his talents, he had one rule he never broke. He never ventured into the dark woods after sundown. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about the dark woods. It was said that at night, the forest came alive with the whispers of lost souls and the footsteps of shadowy creatures. Many who had entered after dusk never returned, and those who did were forever changed, their eyes haunted by unseen horrors. One cold autumn evening, Hans received an urgent plea for help from a neighboring village. A storm had ravaged their homes, and they desperately needed wood to repair their shelters. With a heavy heart and a sense of duty, Hans decided to break his rule. He set out with his trusty axe, determined to help his neighbors, even if it meant entering the dark woods at night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew darker and more sinister. The trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Hans pressed on, ignoring the growing sense of dread that gnawed at his stomach. He worked quickly, chopping down the needed wood, his breath visible in the cold night air. As he gathered the logs, he heard it, a faint, mournful cry echoing through the trees. Hans paused, straining to listen. The cry came again, closer this time, like a child weeping in the darkness. Despite his fear, Hans couldn't ignore a cry for help. He followed the sound, deeper into the forest, until he came upon a clearing bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. In the center stood a beautiful maiden, her white dress glowing in the moonlight. She looked at him with sorrowful eyes, her tears glistening like diamonds. "Please, help me," she whispered, her voice like a breeze rustling through leaves. "I am cursed to wander these woods for eternity, unless a brave soul can free me." Hans, his heart aching with compassion, stepped forward. "How can I help you?" he asked. "You must cut down the tree that binds my spirit," she replied, pointing to an ancient, twisted oak at the edge of the clearing. Without hesitation, Hans swung his axe, the blade biting deep into the gnarled trunk. With each stroke, the forest seemed to grow colder, the shadows closing in. At last, the tree fell with a thunderous crash, and the maiden let out a sigh of relief. But as Hans turned to her, he saw her eyes change, a malevolent glint replacing the sorrow. Her beautiful form twisted and contorted, transforming into a hideous, cackling witch. "Foolish mortal," she sneered. "You have freed me from my prison, but now you shall take my place." Hans tried to run, but the shadows ensnared him, pulling him into the darkness. His screams echoed through the forest, but no one was there to hear. The villagers searched for him the next day, but all they found was his abandoned axe and a new, twisted tree at the edge of the clearing. From that day on, the villagers told the tale of Hans, the brave woodcutter, and the dark woods where he met his fate. They warned their children never to venture into the forest after sundown, for the witch still roamed, searching for her next victim. And in the heart of the dark woods, Hans's spirit remained trapped, a silent guardian against those who dared to break the ancient rule. The Midnight Matinee. The Midnight Matinee. James had always been a horror movie enthusiast, and the buzz around The Midnight Matinee was too intriguing to ignore. Rumored to be the scariest film of the decade, it promised a unique, immersive experience. He purchased his ticket for the special midnight showing, eager to see if it lived up to the hype. The theater was packed, filled with fellow horror aficionados who chatted excitedly as they settled into their seats. The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. From the first frame, the movie was a visceral assault on the senses, its chilling scenes and haunting soundtrack drawing the audience deeper into its twisted narrative. Halfway through, the atmosphere in the theater shifted. The temperature dropped, and the air grew thick with an unsettling tension. James felt a strange pressure in his chest, an inexplicable dread. The screen went black, and a low-frequency hum filled the room, vibrating through their bodies. Suddenly, the screen flashed with disorienting images, grotesque faces, writhing bodies, eyes that seemed to stare directly into their souls. James's head throbbed, and he clutched his temples, trying to shut out the maddening images. Around him, the audience began to moan and writhe in their seats. Without warning, the lights flickered on, and James saw the horror unfold. People were convulsing, their eyes rolling back in their heads. A man in the front row let out a guttural scream, then lunged at the woman next to him, tearing into her flesh with his teeth. Blood sprayed across the seats, and the theater erupted into chaos. James's heart raced as he watched in disbelief. People were transforming into ravenous beasts, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. He stumbled out of his seat, desperately pushing through the frenzied crowd, searching for an exit. The screams and the wet sounds of tearing flesh echoed around him, a macabre symphony of carnage. He reached the lobby, where the madness had spread. Theater staff and patrons alike were caught in a brutal melee, ripping and tearing at one another. James's mind raced, trying to comprehend the nightmare unfolding around him. He had to get out, had to escape this waking hell. With a final burst of adrenaline, James burst through the emergency exit, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. He ran, not daring to look back, the sounds of slaughter fading behind him. His lungs burned and his heart pounded, but he didn't stop until he was miles away. Collapsing in a gas station parking lot, James tried to catch his breath. He realized the terror was far from over. The movie, whatever it had done to them, was out there, spreading its malevolent influence. The midnight showing had awakened something dark and insidious, and now the taste for human flesh was loose in the world.